My name is Renee Conroy, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. This fall, in response to recent international politics, the B&W philosophy program is offering a series of online reflections on the nature of exile and the refugee. In this post, I invite you to think with me about some potential relationships between doing philosophy and the state of being disruptively dislodged from one's community. To this end, I offer two online resources for your consideration. The first is a brief essay contributed to the New York Times column Stone, which, from 2010 to 2021, featured articles by contemporary philosophers that, according to the Stone itself, were on issues both timely and timeless. The piece under consideration today addresses, quote, the wisdom of the exile, and was written in 2014 by a professor of philosophy at Texas Tech University, Costica Bradatan, who I'll hereafter refer to as Dr. B, just in case I'm mispronouncing his last name. Dr. B also published a book in 2015 entitled Dying for Ideas, The Dangerous Lives of the Philosophers. And his overall approach is intriguing for the close connection he traces between being a philosopher and being a kind of refugee. Now, Dr. B begins by noting that forcible exile is appropriately regarded as a misfortune, as it puts people through, quote, the meat grinder of uprooting. Thus, he claims it creates a, quote, existential earthquake in which everything turns upside down and all certitudes are shattered. Dr. B also notes that, quote, from Ovid to Dante to Milosz, exile has been portrayed as a catastrophic event. If such uprooting comes to the exiled person as a form of death, then it's not just his own death, but that of the world that dies with him and in him. But might there be a silver lining, a reverse upside to the damages suffered as a result of being exiled forcibly or voluntarily under difficult circumstances? That is there any possible benefit to being cut off from one's own roots and sense of self? Dr. B suggests there might be, writing, quote, yet exile, should you survive it, can be the greatest of philosophical gifts, a blessing in disguise. This is because, on his telling, quote, exile gives you a chance to break free. That is, to divest yourself of the cultural expectations and assumptions that pervade your worldview. Now, by having our certitudes shattered as a result of being thrust into an unfamiliar world, and consequently regarded as a foreigner, Dr. B argues that we have the potential to, quote, gain something else, new eyes. In short, when our assumptions and intuitions are both laid bare and challenged, we confront an invaluable opportunity to revise and rebuild our understanding of the world and of ourselves. Now, while it might be plausible that hard-won wisdom can emerge from involuntary or unanticipated cultural displacement, Dr. B defends a further and perhaps more controversial thesis. He argues that it is, quote, in fact, obligatory for the philosopher to, quote, practice uprooting if they're to do their job properly. And he cites Socrates as a telling, even if somewhat overworked, example. Of course, it's well known that Socrates accepted death over physical exile from Athens as the penalty for having been charged with impiety and various forms of corrupting the youth by exposing them to new ideas. Dr. B, however, suggests that these charges were themselves the result of Socrates having conscientiously, quote, turned himself into an outsider in his own city, having done so by continually questioning the assumptions of those who were the acknowledged voices of wisdom in ancient Athens, including the politicians, religious leaders, and even artists. Now, although Socrates rejected actual exile to preserve his moral and intellectual integrity, he had, on Dr. B's telling, already exiled himself symbolically by actively uprooting himself from the accepted wisdom of his community. And it is this kind of divestment that Dr. B suggests is required of every serious philosopher. But one might ask, is it truly a requirement that the philosopher, or anyone who seeks philosophical wisdom, must engage in what might be called voluntary exile in place? To the extent that philosophers seek to reveal and disrupt unexamined assumptions about how the world works and what is of value, and where humans can find their appropriate place in the grand scheme of things, the answer to this question might seem to be yes. Consider, however, that the history of philosophy is filled with revered thinkers who, unlike Socrates, accepted actual exile as the consequence of publicizing their so-called dangerous views. It's also filled with others who publicly reversed their controversial theses in order to remain the citizens of their homelands. So, what do these broader facts about the history of ideas suggest about Dr. B's claim that, quote, to the extent that philosophy is exposure of everything, especially things no one wants to hear about, foreignness is highly necessary for its practice? Has Dr. B accurately characterized the pursuit of philosophical understanding? Or could a philosopher productively explore and perhaps explode our assumptions by exploiting familiarity, rather than by adopting a strategy of intellectual refugeeism? Now, to reflect more deeply on the degree to which Dr. B has captured something important about both the possible value of exile in general and its putative necessity to a serious philosophical life in particular, I invite you to consider a second resource I recommend, which you will find very brief accounts of 7 famous philosophers who were temporarily or permanently exiled from their homelands, including Aristotle, Confucius, and Rousseau. Of course, further reflection is needed to determine if philosophers have an obligation to adopt symbolic exile by becoming an intellectual refugee in place, or more strongly, to court actual exile as a result of their public work. It's clear, however, that questions about the relationship between wisdom, displacement, discomfort, and world rebuilding can never be far from any philosopher's mind, no matter what era or what community they call home. So thank you for joining me, and do stay tuned to PNW Philosophy Program's social media channels for more reflections on exile, refugees, and many other philosophical topics that are both timeless and timely.